Guangxi, Impromptu Songs of a Farmer, number 8. I've planted over 100 mulberry trees, planted 30 acres of millet. So of food and clothing I've plenty. From time to time I meet close friends. When summer comes, we have wild rice. Once autumn arrived, there's chrysanthemum wine. My wife gladly welcomes them. My children know to tiptoe about. At sunset, we sit idly in the garden, under the spreading shade of elm and willow. They're drunk, they ride home at night, as a cool breeze blows through my window. I gaze at the river of stars, so clear and close, watch the dipper rise and set. I have a couple of jars, not yet opened. Will we be able to drink them tomorrow? So we continue, we move on from early Tang poets, in this case to a Hight Tang poet. So Guangxi is a Hight Tang poet. He lived during the first half of the 8th century, from 706 to approximately 762. As usual, when we include poets in this series, we have to start first by giving a justification of why we include them. So, in the case of Guangxi, I must say that he is a poet that is very, very, very frequently referenced in anthologies. In fact, while preparing for this series, I made some inquiries into some of the anthologies that I have at home, whether in book form or in digital form, to see which poets were included in those anthologies, but not in 300 Tang poems. And the results with respect to Guangxi are very illuminating. He is actually a poet that is included in a lot of anthologies except for this one. So you can take a look at the first video I posted in this series to see all the books, all the anthologies I checked. But Guangxi, is not in 300 Tang poems. He's not included there, but he is in Poems from the Masters. He is in Sunflower Splendor. He is in the Columbia Anthology. He is in the Anchor Anthology of Chinese Verse. He is in Lau and Minford's Anthology of Chinese Literature. He is in Owens's Anthology of Poetry. He is in Burton Watson's Anthology, and he is even in Fletcher's Anthology, a very old one. In fact, he was the only poet who does not appear in 300 Tang poets to appear in all of these 8 other anthologies I consulted. So only for that reason, I think he definitely deserves a place on the table. In those anthologies, even in the big ones like Sunflower, he is not very well represented. Like, he has at most 1-2 pages of poetry. In most of those anthologies, he just has one poem. So I'm only going to include him here with this solitary poem itself. But he should have been, and he is. Guangxi also has, there is a master's dissertation on him in English titled Guangxi, a belated silver poet of the Hight Tang. And the title and the contents, I recommend the master's thesis. You can download it on the internet if you search for it. I think the title very well epitomizes the status of Guangxi. Guangxi is a decent enough poet, but he had the relative misfortune of living and writing in the Hight Tang when some of the greatest poets of all of Chinese literature thrived. So compared with them, of course, he pales like the moonlight pales compared with the sunlight, but he is good enough. Brief biography, and then we comment a few things about his style, and then we go into the poem itself. So as we said, he lived in the first half of the 6th century. He was from modern Jiangsu, from Jiangling County, and he spent his early life in the court, where he was moderately successful. He knew some of the great poets like Wang Wei and Cui Hao. He studied at the Daxue, the National University, and he passed the Jinshi in 726 when he was 20, which was quite an early age, and held different minor positions at court. not important ones. He later retired, and after a few years returned to serve in the court again. During the Alishan Rebellion, he was captured by the rebels, and after he was freed, he was punished for his treason in letting himself be caught by the rebels and serving under them, even if it was under duress. So he was posted to some places in the south of China and banished to the south, where he died. Now, Guangxi as a poet, well, a lot of his poetry has been lost, most of it. There were 70 juan of his poems, now only 4 or 5 remain. And you can classify his poetry into two types. On the one hand, he has court poems, which are very much like the typical court poems of the early Tang, which we have discussed in their major representatives in previous recordings. But he is today mostly known for the other lot of his poems, his poetry in the style of Tao Qian. Like Guangxi, one can see Guangxi as a latter-day Tang Tao Qian. His poems in the fields and gardens style, generally old-style poetry, like the poem we've read now. It's not a regulated poem. It's pentasyllabic, but it has 16 lines, so it's double the length of a regulated poem. We've seen some old-style poems in the anthology, in 300 Tang poems. They're generally more narrative, freer. They don't have the rigid constraints of tone patterning, which anyway is lost in translation, but also in the parallelism. There aren't fixed places for parallelism, and it doesn't have to be as rigid as it has to be in a regulated poem. So generally, old-style poems read more like narrative poems that describe a scene. Very good for ballads and this sort of thing, but also for describing any slightly extended episode or impression. So this poem that we've read fits very well into those Tao Qian-esque types of poems about farming, the joys of country life, etc. This type of gentleman farmer poems are, as I said, epitomized by Tao Qian, who founded the genre. And in fact, the poem we read today is very similar to a poem by Tao Qian that I remember that, basically explains the same thing. Tao Qian is resting after having done agricultural labor in the fields. He is now having some free time, opening a jug of wine, inviting a neighbor to share a chicken with him. His children and his wife are respectful and are around and don't disturb the gathering. And Tao Qian enjoys the pleasures, gets slightly tipsy with his friend, and ends up with some sad melancholy thoughts. So this poem is exactly the same sort of thing. The topic is the pleasures of the retired country life, from the point of view of the gentleman farmer, of the person who, at least in theory, works his own fields himself and is not preoccupied or worried about positions in office, but just enjoying the simple life with the simple pleasures of farming, of company, of friends, drinking, and so on and so forth. As I said, Guangxi has other poems which are not going to comment, both the courtly ones. Also, he has a group of quatrains, I think about, maybe not quatrains, but has some poems describing immortals and that sort of thing. Okay, let's go to the present poem. As we said, this poem is a fields and gardens style poem praising the pleasures of the humble gentleman farmer's life. And as I said, it's 8 couplets, 16 lines. So let's go as usual, couplet by couplet. Couplet number 1. I've planted over 100 mulberry trees, planted 30 acres of millet. So the poem begins very squarely with this agricultural image. So the poetic persona is a farmer, a sort of farmer, probably a gentleman farmer, but a farmer nonetheless. What does a farmer do? Well, they plant things, they cultivate plants. And 2 things are mentioned: 30 acres of millet, 100 mulberry trees. That's parallelistic. So it's a parallelistic couplet to begin with. And the millet, I think we've mentioned it a lot. Millet was the typical cereal of ancient China, especially before the extension of rice cultivation and its flourishing in the south. I think it only becomes a staple food even in the north, starts to become one during the Tang Dynasty. Before that, and especially in northern China, the staple cereals were millet above everything else, and also wheat and a few other cereals, perhaps sorghum, I'm not sure. Definitely millet, like in the oldest Chinese poems, In the Book of Songs, the cereal that is referred to repeatedly is normal millet, panicled millet, glutinous millet used for alcoholic drinks and beverages, but millet here acts as a metonymy for cereals. So the poet has planted cereals, and he has planted mulberry trees. Mulberry trees were used for making silk. So here the mulberry trees stand for the crops that farmers plant for clothing. So crops are planted for food and for clothing. For the lower classes, the typical clothes were hemp. So we would expect hemp cultivation, not silk cultivation, because, silk usage, silk clothing was restricted to the elites. But again, Xu Guangxi is a gentleman farmer, or maybe he's just using the image of silk trees, mulberry trees. But anyway, the works and the days, like Hesiod would put it, I've been directing and perhaps participating directly in planting mulberry trees for clothing, for silk, and cereals for consumption. Second couplet. So the second couplet explains, the first couplet set the scene. We're with a farmer and he's done his job. Why the second couplet expounds on this introduction? What are the consequences of having done the agricultural works that you have to do properly? Well, now, after agriculture comes, after work comes the autumn time of after you collect all the cereal and the silk for relaxing and enjoying free time with friends. Second couplet, so of food and clothing I've plenty. From time to time I meet close friends. So I've done what I should have done as a farmer. My barn is well stocked with cereal and silk, so now I can enjoy the little pleasures. And those pleasures are mainly meeting with friends. Remember, sociality, conviviality with peers is essential in almost all classical Chinese poetry. Even the consumption of poetry generally takes place in such a context. Third couplet. So what are we doing? We also get the season. We already have an implied season because the agricultural work is over. So we should probably be in autumn, winter. But the third couplet starts locating it more specifically. It says, when summer comes, we have wild rice. Once autumn arrived, there's chrysanthemum wine. So again, this couplet again connects us with the agricultural products of a farm. Like the first couplet, here it focuses on food to be consumed and different products. But this also serves to introduce the passage of the seasons. So in summer, wild rice was collected. And now, presumably the present is autumn, and we might imagine late autumn. There's chrysanthemum wine. So the ninth day of the ninth month, in the last month of autumn, was the Chrysanthemum Festival. And one of the things that was done there was infuse the petals of the chrysanthemum flowers in wine. It was believed this helped to prolong life. And Tao Qian also makes references in his poetry, in his bucolic poetry, to imbibing chrysanthemum wine in late autumn. So it's late autumn, almost winter. And as we said, the poet said in the fourth line that from time to time he meets close friends. The next couplet, which is the which is the fourth couplet, moves us to a description of this scene of friends visiting. So fourth couplet, my wife gladly welcomes them. My children know to tiptoe about. So friends are coming, and his family is a nice family, and they know how to get out of the way and how to behave properly when friends are received in the house. Also, the wife is not grumpy at friends coming to consume goods and distract her husband. She receives them well, and the children are well educated enough to know that they shouldn't disturb Papa when he is enjoying some time off with his friends. What do they do? The next couplet, which is the fifth, I think, tells us. And from that to the end of the poem, we get these simple pleasures enjoyed in the company of a friend or friends. At sunset, we sit idly in the garden under the spreading shade of elm and willow. So they are together. They're enjoying the contemplation of nature, in this case sunset, which it's always a beautiful sight. Slightly melancholy, and this will be emphasized in the last line of the poem, because the references both to the chrysanthemum wine in line 6, I think it was, The reference now to the sunset and the reference at the end of the poem to tomorrow, they all emphasize this very common theme in all Chinese poetry: sadness at the passage of time and aging. But it's very subdued, very implicit. So here we have the poet, the poetic persona, and his friend or friends sitting in the garden. They enjoy the freshness or the coolness of a late autumn, summer evening. Not summer, autumn evening. They are looking at the landscape and enjoying it. They're in the shade of the elms and the willows. So it's a lovely locus amoenus. But they're not just enjoying the garden, they're also dead drunk, as the next couplet will tell us. Literally. Dead drunk, they ride home at night as a cool breeze blows through my window. So after the party is over, probably the friends have enjoyed nature, talked about poetry and other aspects, maybe drunk, maybe eaten. They've drunk a lot. So now they leave home drunk, and the poet stays behind. So this would conclude a lot of courtly banqueting poems like the others go. One feels sad at being left alone. But this is not a courtly poem about banqueting. It's the simple life. And the poet continues describing how he thinks, feels, and acts after his friends have departed, and while he's still quite tipsy. I gaze at the river of stars, so clear and close. Watch the dipper rise and set. The evening was spent looking at the garden and enjoying its beauties. Now it's night time. The evening has passed. The sun has set. The starry sky covers the vault of the heavens. The poet looks at the stars in the Milky Way and enjoys those sights of those faraway lights. The river of stars is the Milky Way. A couple of days ago, I went out with my friends at night and we enjoyed quite a nice view of a star-studded vault of heaven, and the Milky Way was very visible. So in late summer, I imagine perhaps in late autumn in China, you can probably get a nice view of the Milky Way, especially in Tang times when there wasn't so much luminic pollution. Anyway, he watches the river of stars. He watches the Dipper, that's the main constellation in the northern hemisphere, Ursa Major, rise and set. So he spent almost all the night awake, which is a very common trope in Chinese poetry. This melancholy, sighing, spending the whole night awake, wakeful, probably because sad, melancholy thoughts are in your head. And actually, the last couplet represents what these thoughts might be. And they're thoughts about drinking, in line with the whole Bacchic character of this poem, but also melancholy thoughts about how time passes. I've a couple of jars not yet opened. Will we be able to drink them tomorrow? The dipper rises and sets. Time passes. Another oblique reference and image to the passage of time, and the poem ends with that sad, melancholy note. I have jars to open. Will they be opened? Will they be opened? Why is there doubt about them being opened? Because, one can die at any moment. And one has to enjoy carpe diem. One has to enjoy the pleasures while one is able to, because life is uncertain. Time passes. And you never know when the last time that you enjoy a convivial drink and the pleasures of life with your friends might be. So, yeah, generally a celebratory poem of the simple rustic life, but with these melancholy overtones that almost all classical Chinese poetry has to have. So, quite a nice poem. As I said, it reminds me very much of one of Tao Qian's own poems, and I personally tend to like this sort of poetry a lot. Tao Qian is one of my favorite Chinese poets, and his followers and imitators like these one. I like the topic and I like the way they develop it, like in a way in which I do not enjoy that much, say, court poetry. So, nice poem.